So, hello everyone. As we are having a first webinar of the project named Using Climate Litigation, financed by International Sugar Fund, we are now going live. I'm Orhan. I'm project coordinator of this project and also currently chairperson of Common Sense Youth Organization. Introduction about the project that I would like to give you shortly. Our project named Youth in Climate Litigation aims to raise awareness among young people on climate litigation, how to go to court and how to put a pressure on the government to demand climate justice. And first phase of the project is digital with webinars. We are going to have three different webinars in different topics. First webinar is today and will be on environmental awareness. We are gonna cover three questions, which is what's the climate crisis and how is it regulated by international law? What kind of measures has been taken by the EU, climate litigation, and human rights? Our first speaker is Chloe. Now I'm gonna pass the floor to Chloe to introduce herself and then give us short, not short, but also basic information about today's topic in just 1 hour. Hello, Chloe.
Hello, hi everyone. Super grateful to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Orhan, do you think there's any way we can start showing the presentation?
Yes, we can. I'm gonna share it right now. Just a minute. Here it is. Do you see it?
Yes, I can see it. If you can go to slide 2 so I can give a super brief presentation of myself. So my name is Chloe. I am a climate justice activist based in Brussels, Belgium, where I work to try to make European policies greener and fairer so that we have a shot at a livable future for all. If you can go, yeah, perfect. So the first question of today is, what is the climate crisis and how is it regulated by international law? This is a topic in itself that we could discuss for literally hours. So I've tried to pack as much information as possible into a few slides. And if there are any questions, feel free to ask them at the end. So what is climate change? So the climate, essentially, is the average weather in a place over many, many years. We're talking hundreds, even potentially thousands of years. And climate change, or as I prefer to call it, climate breakdown, because we are facing a crisis and a breakdown, not just a change, is a shift in those conditions. And the way climate breakdown is changing right now is 100% linked to human activity. And this is mainly due to the burning of what we call fossil fuel, which includes oil, gas, and coal, and which we are using for the industry, we're using for our homes, we're using to transport ourselves. And when these fossil fuels burn, they release greenhouse gases, mostly CO2, but also other types of gases. And these gases trap the sun's heat and cause the planet temperature to rise. So the thing is that there isn't just the burning of fossil fuel. There's also deforestation. There's also a lot of different activities that cause climate breakdown, such as intensive agriculture and a lot of others. But fossil fuel is the main culprit. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the IPCC already. So the IPCC is a group of kind of scientists that are working on climate specifically, and they release regular reports, not every year, but every few years, on the state of the planet, how climate breakdown is evolving, and what we should be doing and what policymakers should be doing to halt this. And the most recent report, which came out only a few weeks ago, was very, very clear. And it's kind of a breaking point because for the first time ever, scientists that are usually kind of cautious about the words that they're using have said the climate crisis is unequivocally caused by human activities and is unequivocally affecting every corner of the planet's land, air, and sea already. So this is really big because they are saying that climate breakdown is linked to human activity. And they had never said that in such a clear way before. So it really is a breaking point. And now, hopefully, more than ever, our leaders are able to realize that we need radical change. Yeah, maybe can we zoom in a tiny bit on this one? So this is just, we're not going to get into the detail of this, but this is just to show where the main greenhouse gas emissions come from per sector. And what you can see is that the vast majority of our greenhouse gas emissions come from energy. So as we were saying in the beginning, energy that is used in the industry, so to produce stuff that we consume, but also that is used in construction. Construction is a very big part of climate breakdown, but also for stuff such as transport, for instance. So whether it's road transport, whether it's sea transport, whether it's flying, and then of course you see that the second biggest driver of greenhouse gas emissions is agriculture. So what we call forestry and land use. So land use is notably growing crops, a lot of crops in one place, so monoculture, or deforesting forest to grow other type of crops or to make sure there's livestock. And then of course livestock themselves. There's a statistic which is kind of crazy, is that 97% of all animals remaining on Earth today are livestock. So animals that we as humans are supposed to be eating. So that leaves about 43% of animals that are still wild animals. So it's absolutely insane. We could discuss this graph for ages, but it was just to show roughly where these emissions come from. And it links to something which I think is really important to understand, is that just 100% of companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions, a recent study found. So that is pretty massive. And these companies are obviously fossil fuel producers, and then the investors that give them money. And overall, these companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions, which is kind of insane and puts back in perspective what should be done in order to avoid a climate disaster. And it really is to push for regulations that would make these companies radically change the way they operate and the business model and how they invest in energy. So just a reminder, the last 7 years have been the hottest on records. 2/3 of extreme weather events are linked to human activity. And for instance, this summer in Belgium, we have experienced the worst floods in history and 41 people died. And this is just kind of an example, but overall across the world, thousands of people have already died because of climate breakdown. And for instance, in Madagascar at the moment, there's the first famine that is directly linked to climate breakdown. There's an increase in the amount of hurricanes and storms. There's an increase in floodings. There's an increase in droughts across the world. And then, of course, we are also experiencing a sixth mass extinction. So more than 100 species disappear every day, which is also crazy. And one of the main driver of this mass extinction of biodiversity is climate breakdown. So at the international level, so there are no laws, as we can understand what laws mean, on climate change at the international level. There's a sum of treaties, and most of them are not legally binding. I've kind of highlighted the 3 main treaties, but then of course there are also individual commitments from countries, and these can be, and most of the time they are legally binding. They can be also regional agreements. So in Europe, for instance, we have an agreement as well. But at the international level, that's mainly what we call treaties. And there's 3 of them, and I put them by chronological order. So the first one, it's not really a treaty, but it's the UNFCC, which stands for the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. And this is kind of like the groundwork at the international level on climate breakdown. So it entered into force in 1994, so 27 years ago already. And it has a near universal membership. I think it's one of the only kind of convention of the UN that has a near universal membership. So that means that most countries in the world have ratified the convention and are parties of it. And it's via this United Nations Framework on Climate Change that the COPs, what we call Conference of Parties are organized. And right now, I'm sure most of you know, this COP26 happening in Glasgow. So this kind of takes place through this process. And the main goal of the UNFCC is to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. So that was kind of the original goal, and everything that came out of it after that was linked to that goal. And then a few years later, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, but it was only really kind of entered into force years later, so like 8 years after it was originally adopted. And currently there are 192 parties to the Kyoto Protocol, so a little bit less to the UNFCC. And what it does is it implements the goal of the UNFCC in concrete terms. So it's committing industrialized countries, so countries in the global north mainly, to limit and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in accordance to agreed individual targets. So each country has a target, but there's no really time frame, and that is the main difference with the Paris Agreement. Yeah, we can go to the Paris Agreement, which is the main one, which I'm sure everybody knows about, which is currently the main treaty on climate breakdown. And this is also what is discussed in Glasgow at the moment. So it was adopted by 196 parties at COP26 in Paris in 2015. I'm sure you remember there was a lot of clapping and a lot of celebration when this was adopted. And its goal, contrary to the Kyoto Protocol, is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And those targets are very, very important, and you'll see why in a minute. And to achieve this long-term temperature goal, countries aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible to achieve a climate-neutral world by mid-century. And so the way it works is that sometimes people say that the Paris Agreement is binding. Sometimes people say that it's not binding. And it's not binding in the sense that the only thing that is binding is that countries need to submit their targets regularly. So every few years, they need to say, we have done this, and now we're going to do this for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years. This is binding. They have to do it. However, if they do not respect their commitments, so if a country says, oh, I'm going to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions by 30%, by 2030, and they don't do it, nothing's going to happen. So it's not really binding in that sense, which is a major, major flaw of the Paris Agreement. So the main problems is that 1.5 degrees is already almost out of reach. And this is extremely problematic because 1.5 degrees warming is kind of the threshold in terms of climate justice. So if we go above 1.5 and if we go to 2 degrees, that's already way too much, especially for countries in the global south, because they are already feeling the impacts of climate breakdown. And as I was saying in the beginning, some countries are already suffering, some people are already dying, and we're saying that the limit between 1.5 and 2 degrees is the limit between life and death for a lot of people in the global south. I'm thinking island nations, for instance, that risk disappearing if we reach a warming of 2 degrees, because the sea levels are going to rise. And the problem is not only that 1.5 is already out of reach according to some scientists, but it's also that right now, with the commitments that we have, that countries have already submitted ahead of the COP, we are heading towards a warming of 2.7 to 3 degrees by the end of the centuries. So can you imagine? We're trying to do everything we can to limit to 1.5, and 1.5 is already really bad. 2 degrees is much worse, but actually we're not even heading to 2 degrees. We're heading to 2.7 and even 3 degrees warming by the end of the centuries. So that kind of shows how much countries are not really pulling their weight. And this is actually the third point, is that the biggest emitters right now aren't pulling their weight. And there was a recent analysis that showed that only one country in the world is doing enough to be in line with the Paris Agreement, and that is the Gambia. And then finance isn't following through. So also one of the main thing in the Paris Agreement was that countries in the global north were supposed to help by giving money to many countries in the global south to transition to a low carbon economy, but also to adapt. And that amount was supposed to be 100 billions every year that would go to countries in the global south. And the problem is right now we are only seeing 80 billions a year, which is nowhere near enough, considering that we should actually see more than 100 billion. Okay, so this is very brief introduction to the climate crisis and what international law looks like. And now we're going to dive in into what Europe is doing, what it should be doing, and what it's not doing. But first, before we dive into this, I just wanted to explain very briefly why I think Europe is such an important stakeholder and actor when it comes to the fight against the climate crisis. So I have a few slides to explain that. And the first reason why we should care about Europe is that the EU is the largest economy in the world and the world's biggest trading bloc. And so that means that many companies across the world and many countries across the world do want to do business with Europe. They want to send their products, they want to have trading relationships with Europe. And so that gives Europe a huge kind of bargaining power with countries and businesses that it makes business with. And so, what we could definitely see is if Europe was serious about the climate crisis, we could see Europe demanding from their trading partners, so whether that's countries, I'm thinking of Brazil, for instance, or businesses, really good guarantees that these trading relationships are submitted to very strong climate ambition, very strong human rights commitments, very strong deforestation-free pledges, and all of that. So this would be extremely important. And via this role of being a very big trading bloc, Europe could definitely do that. The second reason why it's important to care about Europe is that up to 80% of environmental laws in European countries come from the EU. So that means that virtually almost every environmental regulations in European countries are going to go through Brussels at some point or another, so through the Commission, for instance. And this is why we need to put pressure here in Brussels on the European institutions. Because a lot of the time, once we put pressure on the national level, it's actually already too late because it has been decided at the European level. And it's very difficult to have a legislation go back to the European institutions. So we really need to also mobilize not only at national level, but also at the level of the European institutions. The historic responsibility of the EU. So historically, the EU is the second biggest emitter of CO2. And we've seen in the beginning that CO2 is the main greenhouse gas which is responsible for climate breakdown. And so there was a study that was done in the Lancet, which is a very famous science magazine, and it found that the European Union, so that's 28 countries, was responsible for 29% of excess CO2 emissions since 1850 and 22% of global emissions since 1750. The first one is the US, so that is second only to the US. And so what that means is that Europe has a huge responsibility in reducing its emissions faster than other countries because it has that historic responsibility, but it also has a duty to support other regions to transition and adapt. So it means that because of that responsibility, historic responsibility, it should decarbonize much faster than other countries in the world that are still trying to develop economically, but it should also help countries in the global south by giving more money, notably, and by helping them via technology transfer, notably, to decarbonize faster as well. And then there's one or two more reasons, I can't remember, but there's definitely one, which is the clear lack of accountability. So I don't know if there are people who are working at European level, but it's very complicated. It was not designed to be very transparent and to have a very strong access for civil society, whether that's youth organization or just NGOs in general, or even citizens. It was not really designed that way. So it's very complicated. And a lot of people across Europe don't really care about what's happening at EU level because it's that complicated. And also a lot of mainstream media, they don't really have that many journalists to cover what's happening at European level. So all of that put together means that a lot of what's happening at EU level never really reaches citizens in Europe. And this is extremely problematic, of course, because then citizens can't really put the pressure that's needed at European level. And that means also that this creates kind of a lack of accountability. And many policymakers and lobbyists are kind of on a path to destroying the living world without any second thoughts because they know that they're not really being watched. So the European Green Deal, because of course Europe has been doing a few things on climate. So the European Green Deal is it's actually a policy, one of the first policy that was. Can we get to the next slide? Thank you. So what happens is that whenever there are new elections in Europe, so every 5 years, there's a new European Commission that comes in. And the European Commission, it's kind of like the executive body of the European Union. So it has the power to submit new legislative proposals, so new laws, and then these laws are being discussed and adopted or not between the European Parliament and the European Council. And so one of the first things that the European Commission did when it entered in power is to present the Green Deal. And it was supposed to be, according to the Commission President, a man on the moon moment, you know? So it's a set of policy initiatives with the overarching aim of making Europe climate neutral in 2050. So maybe can we zoom in a little bit to show how diverse the European Green Deal actually is? So for instance, there's something about the circular economy. So there was then a circular economy plan that was presented with the goal to making the economy completely circular. Then there's a farm to fork strategy, which is a strategy that is supposed to make European food more sustainable and agriculture more sustainable. Then there's a climate law. Then there's going to be something on sustainable transport. So the goal is to really touch upon every topic where we can reduce our emissions and become more sustainable. So there are a few problems, of course. The main problem is that the first line of the Green Deal presents it as a growth strategy. So it's not really a strategy to make people live better on a more healthy planet. No, it's still a strategy with the first goal of increasing the growth of Europe, which is problematic in itself. Throughout the document, there isn't really at all a single mention of climate justice, which is also problematic in itself, because climate justice should be at the core of every climate and sustainability policy. And one of the first things that came out of this European Green Deal was a climate law. So this is what I was mentioning in the beginning. So a legally binding target by 2030, so that Europe as a bloc should reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by a certain amount by 2030. And there were a lot of discussions, of course, on what should this target be, because then it means that every European country needs to make an effort. And science said that in order to stay at 1.5 degrees, which should be the main target, we needed a target of emission reduction of 65% in Europe by 2030. And after a lot of discussions, the target that was adopted was a 55% emission reduction by 2030. And it's not actually even 55%, sorry, it's 52.8. And the reason for this is that what we call carbon sinks are included in the law. So that's forest, that's peatland, that's all these natural wonders that allow to absorb carbon. So it's not even a reduction of greenhouse gases, an active reduction. It's actually just using carbon sinks as well to absorb the carbon. Ohana, are you still here? I can see myself in big, but I can't see the presentation anymore. Slight technical issue. Let's give a few seconds to Ohana to come back and share the presentation. Thanks for your patience. We're still missing the presentation, so maybe a few more seconds. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, if anyone's watching, feel free to ask questions. That's a good question. I can, but it takes a bit of time. So maybe if you're happy to help me, I'm gonna try sharing it, and then can you tell me if you can see it? Perfect. Okay. Let me know. I'll need to come back to this conversation to see it, but okay. Can you see the screen that says, "Have you ever tried agreeing on something with 27 friends?" Okay, fab. Okay, let's try it this way. Um, Okay, so this is indeed why it's very complicated to get anything done at European level. The main one is that it's very complicated to agree with something on something with when you have 27 countries that are, of course, also representing their interests, and rightly so. So Poland, for instance, has been very complicated in trying to get the climate law passed and other climate commitments because, of course, Poland is almost entirely dependent on coal. A lot of its economy is dependent on coal. But there are also other reasons. Oh, no worries, Ohan. Can you start? Can you maybe try to, yeah, if you can share it again, that'd be great because I don't think mine is so great. Ah, fantastic. We were on slides 24. Can see it loading, but I can't see the...
Do you hear me, Chloe?
I can hear you.
Okay, so I'm gonna try again. Do you see the screen? No, you don't see?
I can't see the screen. I can't see the presentation so far. I can see the youth and climate litigation image.
Okay, I'm gonna share screen again. What about now?
It says it. Oh yeah, I can see it. Okay,
Is it this one?
it's two after.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
This one? Okay. So again, sorry for the trouble.
No
I was
worries.
kind of
Yeah. So as the other reason why it's very, very complicated to get anything ambitious done at European level is also because there is a very strong presence of lobbyists in Brussels, and most of them are corporate lobbyists. So Brussels is believed to be the second city in the world with the highest number of lobbyists, the first one being Washington, D.C. And in Brussels, it is believed that there is between 25 and 40,000 people that lobby, and a lot of them are doing it for corporate interest. So, for instance, I just want to. Can we go to the next slide, because it's also interesting examples um, that shows the importance. Yeah. So in the first 100 days of shaping the European Green Deal, which was the policy I was talking to you about, top Commission officials in charge of this priority, so the European Green Deal, have met 151 times with business lobbyists. So that is more than 11 times a week, while keeping hardly any records of these meetings. So that's an example in the Commission. In the Parliament, a Polish MEP from the ECR group, so that's the right, has an influential role in reforming EU's rules governing billions of euros in energy subsidies. And recently, he refuses to reveal what meetings he has held with lobbyists, has hosted events for the fossil gas lobby, and the amendments he has tabled mirror the industry demands and are now close to being adopted in the Parliament. And then in the Council, there's also an example, like the head of the council meets the head of the industrial agriculture lobby. So you can see there's a very strong presence of corporate influence in Brussels, and that definitely has an impact on the policies that are being adopted. So what's next in Europe? So what's next now that the climate law has been adopted, and this is what the Europe has presented in Glasgow, is something called the Fit for 55 package. So reference to the 55% emission reduction target. This is what it's called, Fit for 55. Can we zoom in a little bit, just to see some examples of the policies? I'm not going to get into all the details, but yeah, so for instance, there's going to be a revision of the effort sharing regulations, revision of the emission trading system, so that is kind of like permits to pollute, revision of energy efficiency directive, revision of the renewable energy directive. So there's going to be a lot of policies that are going to be presented in the next few months to try to really tackle in the electricity industry, transport and building, but also circular economy sectors, to really make sure that in the end we are able to reduce by 55% our emission reduction in Europe by 2030. So this is going to be kind of the hot potato in the next few months and few years in Europe. So yeah, that's kind of more information. It's hundreds of pages of legislative proposals, including the creation of a new EU emission trading system for buildings and road transport, restructuring of energy taxation in Europe, increased renewable energy, and also the introduction of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So that's definitely going to be also a big thing. So we're getting to the third part of the presentation, which is climate litigation and human rights. We're already slightly over in terms of timing, so I'll keep this part quite short. But because of the fact that even with all these commitments, we are heading to a 2.73 degrees warming by the end of the century. Some people, some NGOs, have started taking governments and corporations to court, simply suing them. Like, you have a problem with your neighbor who is not respecting, I don't know, your lawn or your car or something, you're going to take them to court. Well, this is the same. We're getting to a point where the last resort is taking governments and businesses to court. So I just wanted to give you 3 examples of cases, of recent cases that are very interesting, because of course it depends on which countries the case is happening, and depending on the country, what's going to depend is the basis for the case, but also so the legal basis, but also what the court is going to say. In some countries, it's just going to say, "Oh yes, you did a bad thing," but it's not going to force the government or the corporation to make a change. In others, it will. So the first example is in France. French court condemned the government for climate inaction. So that was about a few months ago, just right before summer. And yeah, if we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So what the court said is that the French government failed to do enough to curb greenhouse gas emissions and fight climate change, as it had pledged to do under the Paris Climate Agreement. So this is very interesting, because you see the kind of the main legal basis was the Paris Climate Agreement, even though it's not binding. And the court also said that France was partly responsible for a change in the composition of the atmosphere. And so the case was originally filed in 2019 by a group of NGOs, and it was backed by over 2 million citizens who signed the petition saying they supported the case. And so the interesting thing with this case is that there was a recent ruling a few weeks ago now, but I can't remember exactly what it said. But what was interesting with that ruling before summer is that it said it was just kind of condemning the government. It didn't really say the government needs to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by that much by that date, or pay that much. So it was kind of a victory, but at the same time, it wasn't like the massive victory. But what it did a few weeks ago is that it actually condemned the government to do something concrete. Another interesting case is what happened in Germany. So it was a case between Luisa Neubauer, who is a climate activist from Fridays for Future, who sued the German government. And that was also very interesting, because the court, what it said is that the government's climate protection measures were insufficient to protect future generations. And that is incredible. The court used what we call intergenerational justice, so the principle of that we should care for environment because of future generation, as a basis for the ruling. And so it's also very interesting, because the court said that Germany has until the end of next year to improve its Climate Protection Act to make sure it meets its 2030 greenhouse gas reduction goals more quickly. So that is also a very interesting example, because it demands that the government does something very concrete. And yeah, so it says that young people's fundamental right to a human future were threatened, and that the law in its current state jeopardized their freedom because the goal sets were too focused on dates too far in the future. Yeah, perfect. And then the final case that I wanted to show you was the case in the Netherlands. So NGOs, we can go to the next slide. So the NGO Friends of the Earth did a fantastic job. It got 17,000 Dutch citizens to be co-plaintiff in that case. So essentially it was 17,000 plus a few hundreds that became to the NGO sector that was suing Shell, which is a Dutch company, for its damage on the environment. And they won. After a few years, they won. And what the court said is that by 2030, Shell must cut its CO2 emissions by 45% compared to 2019, which is pretty big, and that it's responsible for not only its own CO2 emissions and those of its suppliers, which is also very interesting, because usually it's only your own CO2 emissions. And it's the first time a company had been legally obliged to align its policies with the climate agreement. So that is also pretty massive. And yeah, so I just wanted to finish by telling you all of this, of course, is incredible and it's great, but it's also very interesting that we fight for ecocide. And I'm just reading the definition of ecocide, the legal one. So ecocide is a massive damage and destruction of ecosystems, harm to nature, which is widespread, severe, or systematic. And the very big difference is that if we get ecocide, if we get the International Criminal Court, which is based in The Hague, to acknowledge ecocide on the same level as genocide war crimes, for instance, or crimes against humanity, that would allow the International Criminal Court to be able to judge these crimes. And what it would mean is that this will be prison sentence. So CEOs of companies that commit ecocide, whether it's overfishing, whether it's deforestation, whether it's climate breakdown, they would be able to be sent to prison. So it wouldn't only be spending money as a fine and potentially, reduce your emissions if they actually want to do it. It would actually be people sent to prison. And that would be a game changer because, of course, going to prison, a lot of these guys don't want that. They prefer to set aside a budget to pay potential fines. So yeah, sorry, I've talked, I think, a little bit too much. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for jumping in on this wagon about environmental awareness. And yeah, if you want to get in touch, you can connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram. I'm the Green Monkey on Instagram. And I also have a podcast which talks about the links between politics and sustainability. So thanks, Ohan.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for amazing information. It should be beneficial and productive for most of us who are basically watching to this live stream. But if anyone who didn't watch it, they can watch also, as it will stay in our YouTube and Facebook channel later. Now it's time for questions and answers. Let's hear from our viewers who can you can comment in the comment section your question, or I can just send the link and you can be here with us asking your question in live session. So let's wait just for 1 or 2 minutes. If there are questions, then we can go on. In the meantime, I can ask a question to you, but it's not much like a question, but your perspectives, let's say. What are, as now it's COP26 going on, I would like to hear from you about your expectations and feelings. What are this from COP26 that you are thinking?
Ooh, I don't have a lot of hope about COP26. I think yeah, there really isn't really any how do you say, any positive developments that usually come to COP because it's non-binding, because it's very exclusionary. So a lot of activists from the global south, they weren't able to attend because of visa, because of vaccine, for instance. It's not the place where change really comes from. I think change comes from people and doesn't come from big international conferences. So yeah, I'm not very optimistic about the outcomes of COP. I think it's going to be a lot of great announcements and then very little follow through.
Okay, thank you. And any suggestions from your side for young people about the environmental matters, what they can do, what should they do?
Get involved in a group, get involved in a movement, anything, whether it's your local group that protects trees, or whether it's a youth for climate movement, or whether it's anything. Get involved in a movement, because to get alone, we feel very hopeless. We feel like we can't make a difference. But when you're part of a movement, then we have much more impact. So definitely organize as movements, as groups. You don't need to tackle climate change. Like, this is a very big, broad ask, but maybe you can protect your local biodiversity. Maybe you can pressure your local council to do something. So act local, think global.
Thank you. I guess there is no questions in the comment section, but you can also ask your questions later. Just put a comment and we can forward it to Chloe. So regarding presentation, if Chloe is okay with that, anyone is interested, yeah, to get presentation.
Yeah.
We can also share it with you if you send us your email. So then that's it. Thank you, Clay. You just covered all the information, all the questions in just, I would say, half an hour. That's a lot. That was detailed for people, and also basic for people that had no clue about environmental justice, environmental litigation, and climate crisis.
Thank
All
you.
right,
Thank you
and
for the invite and have a lovely rest of the day. Bye.
bye. And that's not end of our webinars. We will have other two webinars sooner in the end of November and in December as well. So just stay tuned and wait for more webinars. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.